All right, welcome everybody. This is being uploaded, I guess, as we're talking on our private Facebook page right now, and our YouTube channel as well. For those of you joining us there, welcome for this new session of How to Be an Anti-Semite. This is December 14th, and we are just about a couple minutes from starting. Just taking the opportunity to share this opening slide and thank all of those organizations who are participating in sponsoring, co-sponsoring this course, which we are so grateful. And we're also grateful for all of you, our patrons, those who have made any kind of little contribution or big contribution so that this course could happen. You can still do that. You can go to our website, www.betaleph.org. Find this little picture here of how to be an anti-Antisemite. That's our graphic. If you click on that, it'll get you to the page, and you can scroll down to find where to make a little donation. And if you find this course, if you have so far found this course nourishing, entertaining, whatever it is for you, feel free to acknowledge that by sharing a little bit of a few dollars, a few $100, a few $1,000, whatever works. However moved you feel. So we'll be starting in just a minute now. Okay. All right, so we're back here. And as more people will be moving into our Zoom space, I'm going to start as I failed to do last week with a Shalom Chant so that we can really set the energies for tonight. Also, just take a moment to close your eyes and to find your breath. And let the day that was just recede in the past and find yourself right here, right now. And from that presence, I invite you, if you so choose, to chant Shalom with me. יהיו לרצון עם רפי והגיון ליבי לפניך, אדוני. Holy One of Being, Holy One who expresses through and as each and every one of us. Help us to know your presence in this moment, in this space, as you manifest in between us, that the meditations of our heart, the words of our mouths might flow from the fullness of your being, Holy One. You are source. and you our destination. Amen. So I know I say that every time. We have a lot to cover tonight. And if last week was one of my favorite part in talking about the shift through the Inquisition of kind of a quality of anti-Semitism, of anti-Judaism, this today is my favorite part as far as the time that we are going to cover in Jewish history, a critical time really in Jewish history. And that time is the time of the age of the Enlightenment. This shift into modernity, what we call modernity, and how that is going to bring, and that's what I'm going to talk about tonight, this new concept, this new thing, called the Jewish question. And I'm going to start with 3 quotes to kind of set the ground for this era of the Enlightenment. The first is from John Locke, who wrote in England in 1689, and I quote, "There is no such a thing as Christian commonwealth. Neither pagan, nor Muslim, nor Jew ought to be excluded from the civil rights of the commonwealth because of his religion." Powerful words, isn't it? Another quote, this time from Frederick II, King of Prussia, 1740. He said, "All religions are equal and good, if only for the people that practice them are honest people. And if Turks and heathens came and wanted to live here in this country, we would build them mosques and churches." Beautiful, beautiful quote. The King of Prussia, no less. 1776. Preamble to the U.S. Constitution. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." The Universal Declaration of Human Rights goes together as well with the 1789 proclamation in France from the Revolution. And thus evolve the ideals of the Enlightenment through the 1700s, from philosophers to heads of states to the nation's constitutions themselves. A new age was dawning where scientific knowledge was replacing old superstitions, where progress was more valued than tradition. So, with all those gorgeous quotes from those philosophers, heads of states, from the constitutions of these new nations, how did the Jews fare as modernity was born? This modernity that seemed to move away from the church, which one might think would be a great thing for the Jews. And to answer this question, I want to turn to the story of Moses. No, not the Moses of the Torah, as you might have thought. That would be really far-fetched. And not the Moses of the Golden Age of Spain, as we mentioned, Moses Maimonides. No, not this Moses either. There were 3 Moses in the evolution of Judaism. I'm talking about the third one, the third Moses, Moses Mendelssohn. Oftentimes I say that Judaism evolved from Moses to Moses to Moses, from Moses to Moses Maimonides to Moses Mendelssohn. Moses Mendelssohn was 14 years old in 1742, just 2 years after Frederick II of Prussia made this glorious proclamation, when he left Dessau in Saxony, where he was born, to travel 100 miles north on foot and continue his Hebrew studies in Berlin. When he reached the outskirts of the capital, he was immediately directed to a special gate that Jews were required to use in order to enter the city. The same gate that the farmers were asked to use as they were bringing their livestock into the city. In fact, Jews needed permission to enter the city, even if they were there for a day or two. And as they entered, they were taxed a special tax, not just as they entered, but also a few days later as they left. It was an expensive endeavor to get to Berlin. Because, however beautiful the declarations of equality, of liberty, the Western world over, these were at first, as we know well, mostly aspirational. You know, the product of an elite few who had evolved to embrace maybe a broader, more inclusive worldview. And it will take several generations, and one could argue we are still there, not yet there, for the masses to quote-unquote catch up and integrate this newfound perspective. We know this to be true from the American example, wherein that elite group of white men pronouncing universal equality in 1776 wasn't exactly how they already lived their own lives, was it? In fact, despite the birth of universal consciousness, one group in this burgeoning enlightened society, usually the group in power, would still exclude others, only this time by scientifically demonstrating what they called natural differences. And that's an exact quote. Natural differences. And so this pseudoscientific concept, couched under the umbrella of science, that proved that human nature is different from place to place, from region to region, from meridian to meridian, not just geographically, but also according to, at least, among others, age and gender, and also race. Now that word race, which at first, as we've seen in the context of the Inquisition, related to a people, to a nation, to a tribe, in the course of the 18th century, that term was refined to mean distinct groups of human beings with inherited physical traits and moral qualities. Right? There was two sides of it. Physical traits and moral qualities. And Mendelssohn, since he's the one who's ushering us into Berlin, Mendelssohn will experience firsthand what that meant. So he came to Berlin not just to deepen his religious knowledge, which in fact by his 14th birthday was already prodigious. I mean, the guy was a genius of one of a kind. But he came to try his hand in secular studies, setting himself up as a tutor and a scribe for sacred texts. He earns enough money to buy books, and he buys books about philosophy. He buys books about literature, about mathematics, about science, among many others. He was a born genius, and so he quickly was able to teach himself English, French, Latin, and even German. And some of us may be smiling as he was, living in Berlin, but let's not take it for granted, because up until that moment, like all the Jews at the time in that part of the world, he knew only Yiddish. So for him, that was a new discovery, and he was, as I just said, self-taught. Now, to be clear, the Jews of Europe in the 1700s, unlike Moses Mendelssohn, who was able to travel to Berlin, the Jews were governed. They were governed by and existed within very strict structures of what we can call Jewish autonomy. It's another way of saying the Jews live very much ostracized. And that Jewish autonomy functioned on the basis of Jewish law. And within this context, this social context, you could think of it as shtetls, right, where only Jews lived. Like think Fiddler on the Roof, right? These villages, this society, served their constituents through a vast network of Jewish social welfare institutions, through fraternities, sororities. They provided for their members really from cradle to grave. Education for men. Think Barbara Streisand in Yentl, right? Education for men took place in what's called the Cheder, the Jewish elementary school at first, and then in the yeshiva, which is the rabbinic academy, and centered only around sacred scriptures, sacred sources, religious values, and ensured the transmission of Jewish culture, of the Jewish way of life through the generations. Jews dressed differently than their Christian neighbors. They ate and drank differently. They spoke differently. They read and wrote from right to left. Jews were, all of them, what we would call today, or picture in our mind as the ultra-Orthodox Jews of Brooklyn, of Mea Shearim in Jerusalem. That was us. There was really no other way to be Jewish. Being Jewish was being part of a culture, or a nation, or religion. There was no differentiation in that. There was just being Jewish was all of it. Right? And as Jews lived alongside the non-Jewish world, from place to place, they were accorded residence, rights for, limited number of occupations, of job they could have, of work they could provide, always in exchange of sky-high taxes. I mean, the taxes were always just overwhelming. On top of that, Jewish life was also dictated by charters and edicts from the local authorities, which continued and contributed to a further sense of Jewish separateness, and in that as well of Jewish vulnerability. So that's the picture I wanted to paint of the Jews overwhelmingly, of who we were up until the time of the Enlightenment. And so Mendelssohn is one of the exceptions to that rule. He gets to Berlin, he broadens his interests, as I mentioned, and then he begins to meet like-minded people beyond his limited Jewish circle, and he begins to befriend Catholics, Protestants, and also free thinkers. And all of them, as they meet him one-on-one, I also have to say that he had a severe physical impediment. He was a hunchback, which made him really stand out, as you can understand, not just as a Jew, obviously, but as a Jew with a hump on his back. But just to kind of give you a sense of how impressive his trajectory was as he gets to Berlin in those years. And all of those non-Jewish thinkers, philosophers, theologians that he meets are really, really impressed by his colossal mind. And so they encourage him to write, not just to write, but also to publish his thoughts. And his books on philosophy and literature became quickly staples throughout Europe. Everywhere he was described as a genius, one of a kind, exceptional, and obviously you can always understand, you can already hear what's come next, clearly, and I quote from sources, an un-Jewish Jew. I mean, come on, right? He's so exceptional, so special, such a genius that he has to be, an un-Jewish Jew. Yet as his fame grew, he was allowed now to live outside of the Berlin's ghetto and travel freely, tax exempt. And still, these were blessings only reserved to him. And that never ever, and he writes about it, that never sat well with him. That he was highlighted as the un-Jewish Jew and therefore was allowed, uniquely just him, all of the privileges that he received. And he wrote often that more Jews could be like him. And he wrote that to his Christian readers, right? That more Jews could be like him, straddling both the religious and the secular world, if only given the opportunity. He argued that it could be possible of being both a Jew and a German. I mean, can you imagine the stretch that this was? For us, it's like, for us who sometimes we debate, are we more Jewish than American, more American than Jewish? But for us, it's like we take it for granted. At the time, that was an impossible concept. And he's the first one to advance that as a possibility, that we could be both Jews and German. And you can imagine that he was met fiercely with opposition on both sides. Many Jews feared greatly that secular learning, that opening the doors of the ghettos, would lead to the loss of Jewish culture, of Jewish customs and traditions. But Mendelssohn was undeterred. He co-authored the very first translation of Hebrew scriptures in German using Hebrew characters. Not just translated the Torah in German using Hebrew characters, he also included a running commentary, all with the purpose of encouraging the Jewish youth to actually learn German. And to his great pleasure, the book became an instant success. It was first published in 1783. And in that moment, a seed was planted in the Jewish minds that one could perhaps, in fact, be a modern Jew. A Jew who could also be part of the modern world, who could be German, French, British, Austrian. And yet, as Jews began to explore, broadening their education, Germans were not really also ready to accept Jews as part of the Enlightenment, with the exception of Mendelssohn and maybe a handful of other geniuses. Because prejudices ran deep. And we've seen in the past sessions how you cannot erase 1700 years of church anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, which, I'm just making the point to use together because as far as I'm concerned, and I'm going to make that case, they represent the same hatred. And even the famous Voltaire, which I studied and loved in my secular upbringing in French public schools, because we were taught how a genius Voltaire was, the father of the Enlightenment. Well, Voltaire was a rabid anti-Semite. And, to kind of give credit when it's due, who wasn't? It was kind of in the ether of where people lived. But Voltaire, who is the one who wrote a lot, he wrote that the Jews, and I quote, were an ignorant and barbarous people who have long united the most sordid avarice with the most detestable superstition and the most invisible hatred for everyone by who they are tolerated and enriched. Right? Ignorant, barbarous people, the most sordid avarice, the most detestable superstition, who harbor hatred for every people who they are tolerated by, thank you very much, and in fact enriched by. And he ends his quote saying, "Nevertheless, they should not be burned at the stake." Thank you. There's a story that Hannah Arendt retells. A story whereby a German man argues with a Jew who is making the case that Jews were already part of Germany's socio-economic fabric, that the Jewish people, considered a separate nation within a nation, are hunted everywhere, that the Jewish people is subject to foreign rule, has no power and no dignity, and wanders all over the world, a stranger everywhere. Right? That's what the Jew is arguing with that German non-Jewish man. Jews were desperately in need of political rights. The only Jews that were tolerated were the wealthiest, and as we see, the brightest ones. And they were known as the court Jews, especially at the time of Frederick II. The rest of the Jewish world was exactly as the fictional German character of Hannah Arendt's story, excluded, with few, always revoked rights, and living in extreme poverty. It's very important for us to know that. Because we can't take, Mendelssohn and say, oh, well, look at all the Jews. No. The historians estimate that despite as I mentioned, the many internal Jewish organizations that supported each other, there were about more than 10% of Jews that were homeless. And 10% is enormous number. Those who lacked money or connections had no choice but to roam through life as beggars, traveling through the countryside like really what they became, which is true outcasts. They couldn't find a home anywhere. And so the German locals, through the towns of which they traveled, they wandered, described them, and we have testimonies of that, as hordes of wretched creatures with their children carrying their entire possessions on their backs, unquote. And so, besides the anti-Semitic label of the wandering Jew, right, another stereotype became attached to the Jews, blaming them for the rise in criminality from many. Jews were not the only one who tried to scrape by and who were homeless, obviously, as you can imagine. The Jews actually probably were the best positioned because of all the social support that they had created for each other. We can imagine that in this very challenging time of transition into the industrialized era, there were many gangs who wandered in poverty that did everything they could to survive, and looting was one of them. But obviously the blame was placed on the Jews for all of that. They were the ones who came from other countries to rape our women and steal our jobs and take our foods and loot our villages. Kind of like I don't know, echoes of a certain president making same kind of accusations against Mexican, just to get a sense of how this is still way within and with us today. Now there is an interesting character, a peer, I would say, of Moses Mendelssohn. His name is Wilhelm von Dohm, D-O-H-M, von Dohm. And he is a legal Christian scholar who himself had called for equal rights for the Jews in Germany, who was an ally, and who still wrote, as part of his trying to make the case for the Jews, he still writes in his publication that the Jews may be more morally corrupt than other nations, that yes, they are guilty of a proportionally greater number of crimes than Christians, that their character in general inclines more toward usury and fraud in commerce, and that their religious prejudice is more antisocial and clannish. And these were the writings of an ally, my friends. So that's to tell you the soup in which the Jews were invited into at the time of modernity. And Moses Mendelssohn will respond to Van Dohm and actually many other authors who attacked Van Dohm for even just slightly arguing on behalf of the Jews. And he will kind of try to help his friend Van Dohm and attack his critiques, those who criticized him, in his magnum opus, which I think at some point we will study together here at Bet Aleph, titled Jerusalem. It's a fabulous, fascinating book that really expresses this dilemma the Jews were faced with, that he really was the leader in tackling. Jerusalem is the name of the book, easy to remember. It was published in 1783. And in that book, Mendelssohn will argue for the Jews to finally gain equal rights and be granted German citizenship. And Frederick II, whom I quoted at the beginning, completely ignored the book and the debate that it provoked. And he will not grant citizenship to the Jews of Prussia and Germany until 1812, some 40 years after the book was published. just, in fact, 1812, just 200 years ago, and really long after Mendelssohn had died. But that was in Prussia, that was in Germany, and something else is happening in Austria. In Austria, we have Joseph II, who was moved, in fact, by the debate that followed the book Jerusalem of Moses Mendelssohn, the debate that Frederick II ignored. And as Mendelssohn's book was being published, he himself, Joseph II of Austria, published an Edict of Tolerance, which, though a step forward, read, if you look at the details of it, very passive-aggressive. Its goals, and I'm going to, summarize and quote, these goals were, and I quote now, to make the Jewish nation useful and serviceable to the state. Better education and enlightenment of its youth, and to direct them to the sciences and the arts, unquote. What this is saying, again, you can feel into the come here but stay away kind of thing, right? There's this push and pull. What this is saying is that Jews had to be brought up from their lowliness, their backwardness, their wretchedness. And they were only going to be able to be brought up from their pit by the good, benevolent, enlightened Germans and Austrians who will provide them with proper education. They no longer had to live in ghettos or wear special clothing. Men no longer had to wear beards. Thank you. They could choose their own occupation, even though there were some heavy taxes on them, but most of those were beginning to be abolished. They could travel, and they no longer had to stay indoors during Christian holidays. See, that's a real plus right there. They no longer had to stay indoors during Christian holidays. That's really nice. But they also lost their Jewish social network that I mentioned earlier. Not only that, is that they also lost the representatives they had to discuss and to intervene on behalf of the Jewish community to the leadership of the country. And all of those great benefits and all this openness and all this beautiful edict, of course, only lasted as long as Joseph II was alive. And as soon as he died, many, if not all, of the old restrictions were reinstated soon thereafter. And the changes, even during Joseph II's lifetime, the changes really did nothing, as we can see, to end prejudice and discrimination in society itself. And then came Napoleon. And I'm actually not switching to France, though I might, jump in for a moment there. I'm still in Germany, Austria, because there came Napoleon and his armies. And we can talk about Napoleon and the wave of emancipation that followed said armies and his conquests. But Napoleon came and went. And in the war against the French invading armies, Napoleon unknowingly promoted sharp nationalistic ideals in really all the countries he conquered, but most importantly in Germany and Austria that really resented having been occupied and conquered. When Napoleon invaded a place, he followed the French model and gave the Jews of every place his armies came immediate emancipation. Right? That emancipation, as you can imagine, was forced upon the countries which were conquered. And so when Napoleon's armies receded and eventually were defeated, and the Jews were now still there, and as far as they knew were emancipated, you can imagine the backlash against the Jews because of Napoleon when the local government reasserted themselves. And as invaded nations, besides the backlash against the Jews, there was born this strong sense of people beginning to feel themselves more like Germans than they may have been Prussians or Bavarians or a member of any other mini-state, as really Germany was at the time. And before long, as Napoleon had now receded in history, before long they were debating what it meant to be a German, what it meant to be an Austrian, and who belonged in Germany, and who belonged in Austria. And if you are going to ask who belongs, you're also going to ask who doesn't. And the debate turned eventually toward the Jews. Those Austrians, those Germans turned to each other and said and asked themselves, well, if we are Germans, if we are Austrians, what about these Jews? What about the Jews? And that question became known as the Judenfrage. The Judenfrage, that's a German term. The Judenfrage means literally the Jewish question. And that Jewish question was one that really required an answer. It required a solution. Because when Europeans in general and Germans in this case in particular, debated whether to award Jews civic equality and admit them as citizens, those discussions were often couched in ethnological and anthropological descriptions and assessments of Jews and Jewishness. Just who and what were the Jews? Could they truly ever become real Europeans? Could they truly ever become real Germans, real French, real Austrians? Could they? Would that be ever possible? Now, what is absolutely critical to understand is that what underlies this Judenfrage, this Jewish question, has in fact very little to do with the Jews. It needs to be very clear to us that what was shaking Europe, and really the Western world in general, was a major crisis of identity. This momentous shift away from monarchies and into democracies and empires. This momentous shift away from an agrarian, village-centered life to an industrial, city-centered life was a radical shift that happened for these people, in fact, relatively very, very quickly. And so new ideas of self-definition rocked people's consciousness. And though the Jewish question, and through the Jewish question, Europeans were having a conversation, a debate about who they themselves were. It's so important to understand that. Through the Judenfrage, Europeans were having a conversation, a debate about who they themselves were. As the form of government and society evolved with the rise of capitalism, the rise of industrialization, that what we call the the it world of political, social, and economic structures, Europeans were pushed to redefine where they belonged in the we sphere, the communal sphere, right? And they were also asked to redefine who therefore did not belong in this communal sphere. Because if you want to know who belongs to the communal sphere, what the communal sphere includes, it's always easier to know what doesn't. And that helps you define who you are. And so they're going to look in order to define themselves, to see who didn't have the same values, who didn't really share the same culture, right? And they're going to also need to redefine what it meant to now live in this new, I'm going to call it individualistic world. That was new as well, right? Maybe that's in the I, the inner personal sphere. And sure, this new world offered what is this new concept of individual rights that didn't exist before. Individual rights and protections for the individual. But all of that individual stuff was also very alienating. And so Europeans were having a conversation, they were having a debate with themselves, really that going to last 200 years, through the excuse of the Judenfrage, as an old world was dying and a new one was being born. Now, it is critical for us to see that, because this is happening again right now. This is happening again right now. The Western world in which we live is having a conversation, a fierce political, socioeconomic debate that I believe started some 30 years ago, post-industrialization, where the global postmodern so-called progressive consciousness tectonic plate came crashing against this nationalistic, conservative consciousness of the Enlightenment era, which I am describing right now. And the Jews, once again, are used by each camp as a punching ball, and the Jews are being scapegoated, literally scapegoated, as the worst manifestation of what the other, the other group, the enemy group, embodies. So on the political right hand, this one, Jews are the globalists, the multiculturalists, the multiracial puppeteers of the progressive agenda that is bent on destroying white Europeans' enlightened civilization. Now on the left hand, on the left political hand, we are as Israel is painted to be, the supporters of an anachronistic, religious, illegitimate, non-democratic, racist, colonizing country, puppeteers of the entrenched white supremacist Western governments. Now, do you hear how they are talking to each other, but triangulating the Jews? Here in America, this manifests through an intense conversation of Americans talking to each other about racism, about the guilt in the genocide and ethnic cleansing of the native population, among other topics. Now, do you hear the anti-Semitic accusation projected onto Israel? The Israel is the postmodern token Jew. Understand that. Israel is Shylock. And the Jews, because the conversation is about racism, about the genocide of the Native American population, the ethnic cleansing of the Native American population, or the ethnic cleansing of the Native African populations, right? Do you see how those accusations are projected onto Israel, who is being accused of apartheid, of ethnic cleansing, of genocide? Now, I want you to also think about how the church did the same thing over the 1700 years preceding modernity. How the church was having the same debate, but that debate was an intramural debate on what Christianity is, on the identity of the church, and how the Jews were used as the hated black mirror in the evolution of Christianity. The rejection of the conversos and the Inquisition, as we talked about last week, is part of that inner debate within the church, and so is the Reformation. That's why, as I said before and will say again, to me words like anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism depict the same hatred that expresses one way in one era and a different way in another era. But that was, in a lot of ways, what was happening also within the church all these years, this inner debating. Because the church, like, let's say, and we'll see that in a few classes as we meet again in a few weeks, and as I talk about Islam. Islam, compared to Christianity, was very sure of itself. Islam was, from the get-go, was very grounded in its own identity. Islam was never plagued by the identity crisis, this existential doubt, which I mentioned the first class. That existential doubt, like this feeling of being a fraud, that Christianity suffered from and made Jews suffer for through all of those centuries. Which is why, until very recently, Jews fare, all things being equal, very well under Islam. And I said until recently, because we were never a threat to Islam. We never were competition for Islam. They didn't need us to know who they were until we were a threat to Islam. But that only happened this past century. And when that happened, everything changed. But we'll talk about that when the chapter about Islam comes up. So I want to get back to Europe. I want to get back to the 17 and 1800s. But again, it's very important to be with this internal dialogue that was going on back then and is still going on today, triangulating the Jew in each generation, almost in each era. But we're back in Europe. We're back in the 1700s, and we're back at this place where this accumulated impact of social and economic marginalization that was born of the 1700 years of Christian teachings, which, as we have seen, portrayed the Jews as cruel and inhuman, responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus, doomed to eternal wandering, enjoined to murder Christian children, to use their blood to make matzah, bent on cheating and extorting Christians. All of that led Europeans, both learned and illiterate alike, to question the very humanity of the Jews. Add to that the increasing contact of white Christian Europeans with other races as a result of imperialism, as a result of colonization, as a result of slavery and the slave trade, but also as the result of the great voyages and the great discoveries of European travelers. And so you find now new pseudoscientific observations that human groups are really different from each other physically, morally, as we saw before, mentally, have different capacities, right? And therefore, because of that, they can be scientifically ranked on a scale demarking racial superiority and inferiority. Pseudo-anthropologists and biologists came and classified the Jews as primitive, as separate, as threatening, truly as mere savages. Jews were so unique, so other, that despite having been around the superior white Christians for 1700 years, they still harbored very exceptional physical traits. And they really had not much been changed in their appearance. Now, could it be that all Europeans were subject to change, but not the Jews? Clearly, an inherent peculiar biology created this inalterability, these unique Jewish physical features. And if that was scientifically proven to be the case, that Jews couldn't evolve, couldn't change physically, ergo, they couldn't possibly evolve or change to be good citizens of Europe. Would they ever be capable of becoming productive members of society? Weren't their occupations and religious obligations rendering them useless to society or even harmful? How will they be able to contribute to the general welfare? Would they be able to even serve in the army and go to war if war happens on Shabbat? Will they be able, as soldiers of the nation, to eat the same military rations as the other soldiers? Will they enroll in German-speaking schools, and will they renounce their Yiddish and their Yiddish names? And if they are still praying, quote, next year in Jerusalem on Passover, can they really ever be trusted in their allegiance to the nation? We hear the seeds of modern anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism. We hear the seeds of Nazis' propaganda and justifications for extermination. And in Germany at that time, a suggestion was placed forward that Jews needed to first improve themselves through lengthy periods of re-education in order to prove to the good Germans that they could be full-fledged Germans before any talk of emancipation would happen. In France, as I mentioned, through the French Revolution of 1789, and then after that with Napoleon, the French gave the Jews unconditional rights and emancipation to become French citizens. But there also was a caveat. I mean, they took the opposite route of the German, but the purpose and the point was the same. What the French believed, narcissistic as they are, was that let's give the Jews the French citizenship immediately. Let's open all the doors. Let them go to French universities. Let them be French philosophers. Let them be French capitalists. Let them be French everything. Artists, painters. Because they're going to fall in love with secular French culture. How could they not? It's so enticing. So amazing. Why would they want to keep their unique, specific, backwater, retarded ways? Of course they will give them up. They will become French, and they will give up Judaism. And they will be assimilated and integrated, and they will disappear. That was the gift of immediate emancipation to the Jews of France. It was really a very bitter kind of gift. Back in Germany, the debates never ever ends around the Judenfrage. And with all of the accusations that I just mentioned, more are added. And the one that comes to be most debated is this accusation of the Jews being de facto a state within a state. Well, yeah, in a way they were right, because as long as they didn't have full-fledged access to citizenship, as I mentioned earlier, the Jews could only rely on themselves to survive. The doors were locked and closed, and so yes, they had to create the self-contained societies to support themselves and survive. But what the racist anti-Semitic perspective was that, yes, look at that. They are a state within a state. They have their own rules, their own laws, their own, judicial systems, everything. But only by fostering the right modern enlightened education, only by training those Jews in those new occupations of the modern times, only by helping the Jews transcend those linguistic challenges of their Yiddish speaking, we could reform them. We could turn them into worthy and virtuous citizens. We, and only we, the Christians, could effect such a benevolent transformation of the Jew into a modern man. Okay, so the Jews heard that, obviously. These were public debates. There were a lot of publications. And the Jews heard loud and clear the Judenfrage, the Jewish question, and they decided that they were not going to wait for Christian magnanimous gifting to take their lives into their own hands. And they too, as we will see, they start to give multiple possible solutions to the conundrum of the Jewish question over the many decades in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. Even into the 20th century, by the way. One major immediate response was that the Jews themselves, were not going to wait for the Christians to help them evolve, but they were instead to take their re-education. Those actually were the words the Jews themselves used. They were take upon themselves the improvement of the Jews from within the Jewish community. And Moses Mendelssohn had opened the doors with his Jerusalem, offering the possibility for Jews to compromise between being Germans and being Jewish without losing their Jewish identity. and then his followers jumped right behind him. And the movement of the Haskalah, Haskalah, the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, was born. Now, I have absolutely no time in this course to delve into this, and how the Haskalah unfolded and what they brought to the Jewish people and how they moved the Jewish people further and further into secular Germany. But I'm just going to bring one example that is apt because it is really piggybacking on the work of Mendelssohn and followed by the work of the Haskalah. And that example is one that touches us here every day, which is Reform Judaism. Reform Judaism is born from the work of Moses Mendelssohn and his followers after his death, exemplified through the work of the Haskalah of the Jewish Enlightenment. Now, what was, because the Reform movement is changed in the last 200 years that it's been around, what it was at first was a very radical, I would say, almost extremist, secularist movement. They changed the way the synagogues were built. Until the Reform movement, synagogues were built with the place where the rabbi and the rabbis stood was right in the middle of the synagogue. The ark was in the back wall, but all worship and the chanting of the Torah happened in the middle of the synagogue with the rest of the congregation surrounding the pulpit, if you want. The Reform movement completely did away with that architecture and copied the church's architecture and moved everything to the front and moved the pews who were kind of as a U shape around the rabbis that were in the middle. They moved them facing the ark in the front. So synagogues became modeled according to the church architecture. They were renamed. They were no longer actually called synagogues. They were called temples. So if you have a temple in where you live, you know that a temple is a Reform synagogue. It's a Reform congregation. Why do they call their congregations temples? Because they wanted to answer part of the Judenfrage, part of the Jewish question that said, you're saying next year in Jerusalem on Passover, therefore you're not going to stick around. You're going to wait for the first occasion you have to leave. Why should we give you citizenship? So they named their synagogues temples to show the Christian Germans that in fact they were not looking to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple there, that here in Germany was the temple and they were going to stay and be loyal to Germany. That's why the Reformed temples are called temples. The rabbis were prohibited from wearing a kippah. There were no prayer shawls. There were no Hebrew allowed in the synagogue. The rabbis wore the same coats that the professional pianists wear. I don't remember there's a name for it, but you know what I mean. And top hats. Black top hats, again to resemble the aristocracy, the German aristocracy of the time. All the prayer books were in German. The Torah was in German. Everything was in German. You could enter, again, kippot were banned, so nobody wore a kippah. You could walk into a temple and not know whether you had entered the church or not. The whole impulse was to be accepted, right? The whole impulse for them was to show the Kaiser that they could be full-fledged German and still maintain a little bit of their their Judaism, that they didn't have to completely, dissolve themselves, and the way they would do Judaism now would be like Protestant churches and ministers would. The consequences of that brought about a wave of Jewish conversions. Jewish conversions to Christianity, because once the doors are open and once you're so close to really being just like a church, a Protestant church, then what's to stop some Jew who has already gone that far from just going a little step farther and just say, you know what, I'm just going to be Christian. It's going to make everything just easier. And so many Jews, in fact, converted to Christianity because, despite proving themselves worthy over and over again to the Christian world, Jews were still excluded from most circles, most professions, most, alley of power, definitely from the army and from universities and from the intelligentsia of the time. Mendelssohn's grandchild, the famous composer that we know as Felix Mendelssohn, his actual name was Jacob. Felix Mendelssohn was baptized by Mendelssohn's children, Moses Mendelssohn's children, at the age 7. Heinrich Heine also converted to Christianity. For him, it was to ensure that his work could be heard. And that helped really neither of them. And though emancipation was proclaimed eventually in Germany in 1812, as I mentioned, you cannot erase really 1800 years of anti-Judaism, of anti-Semitism, simply by decree. And in fact, discrimination was still rampant in German society, as it will continue to be all the way to 1933, where something will change, where in fact all of it will become a matter of state policy. Up until then, it wasn't state policy, it was just social, economic part of life. When it becomes a matter of state policy, then things take a turn for the worst. It is that entrenched discrimination that a professor at the University of Würzburg, I'm probably pronouncing this horribly, urged against in a lecture that he gave in 1819, so 7 years after the proclamation of emancipation. And as he did that professor at that university in 1819, he was violently attacked by his own students. And these students took to the streets. And as they take to the streets in violent demonstrations, they are joined by local shopkeepers, local artisans, local workers, and major riots begin to break out through the streets of Würzburg for a whole 7 days, destroying Jewish homes, burning down Jewish businesses, all the while shouting, those rioters, "Hep, hep, death to the Jews! Hep, hep, death to the Jews!" And actually those riots came to be known as the Hep, hep riots. And these rioters had been very deeply influenced by a number of professors who in fact had been preaching a form of nationalism that imagined the Germans as a pure folk, a pure nation, a pure race. And that pure nation, that pure folk, was struggling for freedom from the Jews, who were so great a threat that they ought to be exterminated root and branch, as they wrote in their pamphlets. And so there is a new age of extreme anti-Semitism that is emerging under the guise of nationalism, which I'm going to talk more next time, and will begin to take sometimes very violent forms. And they are also begin to promote dangerous new stereotypes. They're going to build on that idea of the Jews being this hostile nation within a nation. They're going to build on the questioning of Jewish loyalty, right? And they're going to add to these two core anti-Semitic accusations a third one. Let me explain. From time to time, throughout the 19th century, some calamity of one kind or another would befall a Jewish community somewhere in the world, in some other country, right? It was cyclically would happen, right? And as is often the case, I mean, including to this day, we can remember actually during the Cold War, the Jewish population here in America working to free the Jews from Soviet oppression. So it's not something new. As is often the case, Jews from other countries would rally together and try to aid that Jewish community that was in trouble somewhere else in the world. And when that happens, as has always been the case, the wealthy Jews, the Jews who have a certain influence on their government, would do their best to entreat their countries and their leadership in their own country to try and intervene on behalf of these faraway Jews through diplomatic, the diplomatic conduits that states could have. And sometimes, not always, those leaders, the administrations of those countries, were moved enough by the plight of these faraway Jews and agreed to put pressure on the foreign governments where the Jews, those attacked Jews lived, to come to their rescue. And from time to time, lo and behold, it even worked. And from time to time, those Jews who were persecuted were eventually rescued. Nothing wrong with that, one would think. But to the anti-Semite, however, all of these international shenanigans, all of those international affairs involving Jews was proving a new, deeply anti-Semitic accusation that Jews actually had or belonged to a worldwide government that in fact influenced and threatened the citizens of every sovereign country, as they were able to manipulate them, putting pressure on them to get what they wanted. And one of the fiercest promoter of this devastating new shape of anti-Semitism, his name was Wilhelm Marr, M-A-R-R, and he was a German journalist who not just believed in that myth, but is going to do all he can to promote it far and wide. He published a pamphlet in 1876 that he titled, and then I quote, "The Victory of Judaism over Germandom." That's the name of his book. And in it he writes, and I quote, "There is no stopping them. German culture has proved itself ineffective and powerless against this foreign power." So listen to that, right? The Jews are a foreign power, a nation into a nation, right? "This is a fact, a brutal, inescapable fact. State church, all are brought low before the Jewish tribunal. That is, the irreverent daily press which the Jews control. See, another one that we know today. We know to this day. Poor, he continues, poor Judaized France. In 1870 and 71, Gambetta, Simon, and Crémieux were the dictators of France, the instigators of the war against Germany. In England, the Semite Disraeli, a German hater, holds in his vest pocket the key to war and peace in the Orient. Who derived the real benefit at the Congress of Berlin from the spilled blood of the Orient? Jewry. The French Universal Israelite Alliance was first in line. That is the vicious anti-Semitism that is born in the late 1800s. And from that, there are dozens of different caricatures put on in poster forms that are displayed all over Europe. Let me briefly share one just to give you a sense of what people were faced with. This is the picture of James Rothschild controlling the world. James Rothschild, the Jewish capitalist. You see he's got a golden calf on top of his tiara, or whatever that is. And look at his fingers, how he's completely unwrapping the world. Those posters were posted everywhere. You could find them everywhere. And that's how it all gets propagated, with writings and pictures that are better than 1,000 words, right? But Marr doesn't stop here. On and on he goes. Jews were not just a distinct race, he says. They were a dangerous alien race. And he used this word. He used the word anti-Semitism to describe his opposition to Jews. He is the one who coins this word, anti-Semitism. The word, again, that he uses as a description of his own opposition to Jews. So to me, for us to use the word itself is problematic, right? We're literally using the word of someone who coined it to describe how much he hated us, right? And we are using his word to this day. So maybe it's a little bit problematic. Again, anti-Judaism works just as well. He also founded the League of Anti-Semites in Berlin, which is one of the earliest political parties whose entire platform was anti-Semitism. So he founded the League of Anti-Semites in Berlin in 1879 to combat the threat he imagined that the Jews posed. And the group tried to turn anti-Semitism into a popular political movement. And though his party never really gained traction, another party born besides this one, called the Christian Socialist Workers' Party, who was born at the same time, that party had a lot more success. It too embraced a total anti-Semitic agenda, and it gained quickly in popularity as he called to limit access to Jews of certain professions, of universities, and as it becomes now natural and the norm, using modern science to justify discrimination against the Jews. So by the end of the 19th century, in the first 200 years since the dawn of modernity, The Enlightenment ideals that started really well. I mean, those quotes at the start were really good. And the birth of the nation, what we call the nation states, in that time, anti-Semitism had found a home almost everywhere in Europe and beyond. Every country had their own version of those racist ideas and ideals, but every country had some of it. And in Germany, anti-Semitism became mixed with romantic notion of that German folk, that German people, which ranked races, and where Jews lived obviously at the bottom, and this Aryans, the mythical ancestors of the German people, reigned supreme at the top. And it was clear everywhere that the Jews belonged to an inferior race. And that myth continued to grow. And this led to ongoing discrimination and persecution that, if not officially based on ethnicity or religion, were more often than not expressed in religious and cultural terms. So that Judenfrage, that Jewish question, will continue to be debated in every decade, as if talking about the Jews was the never-ending, most important topic that the political class at the time could debate. Very similar with what's going on with Israel today. And those parties in the 19th century wrestled around and around with the Jewish question, each one bringing their own solution to the top of their political platform. And then, after 200 years of never-ending debates about the Judenfrage, about the Jewish question, one man came forward and finally decided that he had found the answer, the ultimate answer. That man was Hitler, and he called the answer to the Judenfrage, to the Jewish question, the final solution. So if you have heard of that term, the final solution, and you wondered all your life, what was this the final solution to? It was the final solution to the Judenfrage, to the Jewish question. So I'm going to end here. Again, miraculously ending at 8:30. You're welcome. We are going to take a break over the next 2 weeks. We'll gather again in January. January 4th will be our next class. We'll be talking about more about nationalism and anti-Semitism, but we'll be mostly focusing on the Dreyfus affair and the protocols of the elders of Zion. Also, two keys to the 20th century anti-Semitism. But since it's only 8:31, I'm happy to open the floor to 1 or 2 questions, and I'll do my best to either answer them or cravenly postpone them for next time.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Yes.
Because I know you said you're going to go into the Dreyfus affair too. At the
Yes.
same time that this is going the same time period, George Eliot, the British writer, she wrote a book called Daniel Deronda. Are you familiar with it at all?
I am not, unfortunately.
Okay, it's kind of almost like a proto-Zionist novel. Kate may know more about it than I do. I'm not sure, but it's worth the read.
Okay.
Over the weekend, Daniel Deronda, and also I'll throw out that with the Protocol of the Elder of Zion, Umberto Eco wrote a fictional account of how it was written called The Prague Cemetery.
Okay.
So that. But I wanted to ask, because you're going to go through Dreyfus at the next.
At length, yes,
Okay.
because it is so critical and so pivotal.
Okay. And at that point, will you be bringing in Herzl too? And
Of course.
okay.
Yes.
Just wanted to know where I'm going.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hadia, unmute yourself and.
Yeah. Okay. I just have a quick one. You mentioned about Israel, about what's the thing, the thing we keep hearing over and over again by Jews about how we're, what we're doing to the Palestinians. Will you address that at some point at the end?
Oh my gosh, I'm going to address that in such great length that
Right.
you're going to be tired of hearing about it.
No. We need to.
No. So it is obviously part of. So those are going to be the last few sessions. I think I've reserved about 5 sessions to talk about what's going on today around the world. So there is plenty to uncover and plenty to talk about. But obviously, Israel and the anti-Semitism directed at Israel. But again, as I mentioned today, which really is a triangulation of a conversation happening at home here in America or in Europe. We'll talk at length about what that looks like and what parts are anti-Semitic and what parts are not, because I think it's also important to mention that as well. Sherry, and I'm not saying last names because again this is being publicized for the world to see, and I want to keep your confidentiality intact. Sherry, no, Sherry. I'm going to say Sherry S before we go to Sherry R.
Oh, okay. I just had a question. I was taking notes on the professor of Würzburg. Was he advocating emancipation or was he against emancipation?
Yeah, he was attacked because he was he wasn't proposing emancipation. This happened in 1819, and so emancipation had happened 7 years prior. He was just making the case that this was a good thing, and that we should continue and overcome our racism, our anti-Semitism, and that's got him in trouble.
Okay, that's thank you.
Sherry.
Hi.
Hi.
First of all, thank you so much, Olivier. I thought I knew what anti-Semitism was, and there's so much to know, and I really appreciate the whole history with that as the guiding light of the world history. I have 2 questions. One is, you mentioned earlier on about the question of Israel being accused of apartheid. What is an appropriate, helpful response to that when we hear it? And then sort of in general, what can we do? How can we, this is probably the question of the ages. How can we help this? How can we change it?
I will, and I would do my best to answer both those questions as the course unfolds. There are clear answers to those, and we'll see. I don't want. It's hard for me to answer because we don't have all the material in front of us yet. When we have all the material in front of us, I think a picture will just appear to how to address those issues and what's possible in countering the anti-Semitism, including those accusations against Israel. Like I said, were really just a projection, a triangulation on the Jew, which now is under the guise of Israel. Israel is the Jew. To really kind of get a good sense of what's underneath all of that. But we're not there yet, and I can't answer. You can feel that I'm really hesitant. But we're just a few weeks away, so bear with me.
I'm happy.
All right. If there is nothing else, I hope you enjoy the rest of this year, that you get to celebrate the transition into 2022. And we'll see you in this class January 4th. Take care, everybody.
Olivier?
Yes, we'll do shalom. You're right. Yeah, we should do shalom before we go.
Yeah, but also I just wanted to say that the thing keeps lowering my hand. But I just
Okay.
wanted to say two things. One, thanks to Rich for mentioning that book, and I have just now ordered it. And to Sherry, there are small things that we, just immediately that we can do, such as proudly claiming our own Judaism where we go. And this season right now is a perfect time when people say,
Right.
Merry Christmas. I do say Merry Christmas, and I say Happy Holidays. And if they ask for more information, are you all ready? Oh yeah, I am ready because I'm done with Hanukkah.
Yeah.
Small stuff like that.
Exactly. I mean, yeah, just to claim our ground and not cede it. It's always good. It's always good. Rich, can you put in the chat? Somebody's asking if you could write the name of the book and the author. I think that would be great. So I'm gonna leave the link open so that everybody has the time to write it down. But I'm gonna stop we're gonna say Shalom chant, and while Rich does that, so that should give everybody enough time. But close your eyes. And from the invitation of the silence, take a breath for Shalom. Danny, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.